The summer heat of ancient Babylon pressed down like a suffocating blanket as servants scurried through the corridors of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, their sandals echoing against marble floors that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. But on this sweltering day in June 323 BC, they were about to witness something far more sinister than political upheaval. They were about to watch the most powerful man in the world die in agony, his body betraying him in ways that would shock even the battle-hardened veterans who had followed him across 3 continents. The man writhing in that royal bed was no ordinary mortal. Alexander the Great, King of Macedonia, Pharaoh of Egypt, Lord of Asia, and conqueror of the Persian Empire, commanded territories stretching from Greece to India. His very presence could inspire armies to march into hell itself. Yet here he lay, reduced to something barely human, his legendary strength crumbling as an invisible enemy ravaged him from within. What you've been told about Alexander's death is sanitized history, a comfortable lie that historians have perpetuated for over 2 millennia. The textbooks speak of a brief illness, perhaps fever or pneumonia. Some romantic accounts describe peaceful final moments where he nobly declared his empire should go to the strongest. These stories paint a picture of dignity in death, a hero's farewell befitting the greatest conqueror in human history. The reality was infinitely more horrific. The truth about Alexander's final days reveals a death so brutal, so prolonged, and so psychologically devastating that it would haunt the ancient world for generations. This wasn't the quick end of a warrior cut down in battle. This was systematic destruction, a slow dismantling of human dignity that transformed the most feared man alive into a helpless victim of forces beyond his control. To understand the true horror of what happened in that Babylonian palace, we must first grasp who Alexander had become by 323 BC. This wasn't the idealistic young prince who had crossed the Hellespont 13 years earlier with dreams of glory. The man dying in Babylon was something else entirely, shaped by years of unimaginable violence, absolute power, and the psychological toll of conquering half the known world. Alexander had witnessed horrors that would break ordinary minds. He had ordered entire cities razed to the ground, their populations sold into slavery. He had watched friends die in agony from infected wounds, seen elephants trample his soldiers into bloody pulp, and personally killed men with his bare hands in drunken rages. The golden-haired youth who had wept at Homer's tales of heroic warriors had transformed into something far darker, a being who demanded worship as a living god, while his sanity slowly crumbled. His body bore the scars of this transformation. An arrow had punctured his lung in India, leaving him gasping and weak for months afterward. A sword had nearly severed his neck during the siege of Multan. His skull showed fractures from multiple head wounds that would have killed lesser men. But these visible injuries were nothing compared to the invisible damage accumulating within. The heavy drinking that defined Macedonian court culture had become Alexander's refuge from the weight of absolute power. Night after night, he would drain cup after cup of wine, seeking oblivion from the voices of the thousands he had killed, the friends he had murdered in paranoid fury, and the impossible burden of maintaining an empire that spanned 3 continents. By June 323 BC, those closest to Alexander knew he was no longer the man they had followed from Macedonia. His mood swings had become violent and unpredictable. He would order executions for imagined slights, then weep inconsolably over the deaths of men he barely knew. His grief over the loss of his closest companion, Hephaestion, had driven him to even greater extremes of behavior that shocked his battle-hardened generals. The setting for Alexander's final ordeal was itself steeped in ancient power and mystery. Babylon had been the jewel of the Persian Empire, a city where the very stones seemed to whisper of bygone glories. The Hanging Gardens, if they truly existed, created an otherworldly atmosphere of beauty that contrasted sharply with the brutal realities of imperial administration. Here, surrounded by wealth beyond imagination and commanding armies that could reshape the world at his whim, Alexander would face an enemy that recognized neither rank nor reputation. The party hosted by Medius of Larissa seemed innocent enough at first. These gatherings were routine affairs where Macedonian nobles would drink themselves into stupors while discussing future conquests. Alexander attended such events regularly, using them to gauge the loyalty of his subordinates and plan his next campaigns. He had recently been considering an invasion of Arabia, perhaps even a return to Greece to crush growing opposition in Athens. But this particular evening would prove different from all the others. As wine flowed freely and conversations grew louder, something entered Alexander's system that would begin a process of internal destruction unlike anything witnessed in the ancient world. Whether through deliberate poisoning, contaminated drink, or simple misfortune, the most powerful man alive had consumed something that would systematically dismantle his legendary constitution. The morning after Medius's party brought the first signs that something was catastrophically wrong. Alexander awoke, not with his usual hangover, but with a fever that seemed to burn from within his very bones. His servants found him drenched in sweat, his skin flushed and hot to the touch, his breathing labored and painful. Yet even as his body began its rebellion, Alexander's iron will refused to acknowledge weakness. He forced himself to perform the daily rituals of kingship, conducting sacrifices to the gods, and meeting with his generals to discuss upcoming military campaigns. To those around him, he appeared merely tired, perhaps suffering from too much wine and too little sleep. As the hours passed, however, the fever intensified into something far more sinister. Alexander's skin began taking on an unnatural pallor, his eyes becoming bloodshot and wild. Servants reported that he would suddenly cry out in pain, clutching his abdomen as if something were tearing him apart from within. The royal physicians, summoned urgently to examine their divine patient, found symptoms that defied their understanding of medicine. The progression of Alexander's condition followed a pattern that would have been familiar to modern doctors, but was utterly mystifying to ancient healers. His temperature soared to levels that should have killed him outright, yet he remained conscious and lucid. His pulse became rapid and weak, his breathing shallow and labored. Most disturbing of all, he began experiencing episodes of intense abdominal pain that would leave him writhing in agony before suddenly subsiding. By the third day after the party, Alexander's famous voice had become barely a whisper. The man whose battle cries had once rallied thousands of warriors could no longer speak above a hoarse croak. His legendary appetite vanished completely, as even the smallest amounts of food or water would trigger violent vomiting episodes that left him weaker than before. The royal court watched in growing horror as their invincible leader deteriorated before their eyes. Generals who had seen him lead cavalry charges against overwhelming odds now witnessed him struggling to sit upright in bed. The hands that had wielded sword and spear with deadly precision now trembled uncontrollably, unable to hold even a cup of water. Perhaps most terrifying of all was what happened to Alexander's mind during these early stages of his final illness. The sharp intelligence that had outmaneuvered every enemy he faced began showing signs of confusion and disorientation. He would forget the names of trusted subordinates, speak to people who weren't there, or suddenly become convinced that long-dead companions were standing beside his bed. The physicians who attended Alexander during these crucial first days left detailed records of symptoms that paint a picture of systematic organ failure. They described a patient whose skin had taken on a yellowish tinge, suggesting liver damage. His urine had become dark and bloody, indicating kidney involvement. Most ominously, they noted episodes where Alexander would lose consciousness entirely, his body going rigid as if seized by some invisible force. As word of the king's condition began spreading through Babylon, panic started taking hold among the thousands of soldiers, administrators, and hangers-on who depended on Alexander's continued rule for their positions and very survival. The vast empire he had conquered was held together primarily by fear of his personal authority. Without that stabilizing force, the carefully maintained balance of power between Greek conquerors and conquered peoples would collapse into chaos. Yet even as his body betrayed him, Alexander continued attempting to fulfill his royal duties. Between episodes of fever and pain, he would insist on being carried to the palace gardens, where he could breathe fresh air and attempt to conduct the business of empire. These moments of apparent recovery gave false hope to those around him, making his subsequent relapses even more devastating to witness. The true horror of Alexander's condition was only beginning to manifest. What had started as fever and abdominal pain would soon escalate into something far more grotesque, a systematic breakdown of every system in his body that would leave even his most loyal followers questioning whether their king was still human or had become something else entirely. The Gardens of Babylon, once a refuge where Alexander could find momentary peace, became a theatre of mounting dread as his condition entered its most horrifying phase. By the 7th day after Medius's fateful party, the king's deterioration had accelerated beyond anything his physicians had witnessed in their combined decades of practice. What they observed challenged their understanding of human physiology and left them questioning whether they were treating a man or witnessing some divine curse unfold. Alexander's fever, which had initially seemed manageable despite its intensity, began manifesting in ways that defied medical explanation. His skin, once bronzed from years of campaigning under foreign suns, had taken on an unnatural translucent quality that allowed observers to see the dark network of veins beneath. Servants reported that touching the king's flesh felt like placing hands on sun-heated bronze. Yet he would suddenly be seized by violent shivering fits that made his teeth chatter audibly throughout the palace halls. The abdominal agony that had plagued him from the beginning intensified into episodes so severe that Alexander's screams could be heard echoing through the stone corridors of Nebuchadnezzar's ancient palace. These weren't the controlled grunts of a warrior enduring battle wounds, but the raw, animalistic howls of someone experiencing pain beyond human endurance. During these attacks, his body would contort into impossible positions as he clawed at his stomach, his fingernails leaving bloody scratches across skin that had turned a sickly yellow-green. The royal physicians, desperate to provide relief for their dying sovereign, attempted every remedy known to ancient medicine. They applied heated oils and aromatic herbs to his chest, believing the vapors might drive out whatever evil humors had invaded his body. They administered purgatives that left Alexander retching violently, bringing up nothing but bile and blood. They even resorted to trepanation, drilling holes in his skull to release the pressure they believed was causing his mental confusion. Nothing worked. If anything, their interventions seemed to accelerate his decline. By the 9th day, Alexander's legendary strength had abandoned him entirely. The man who had personally led cavalry charges against war elephants could no longer lift his own head from his pillow. His arms, which had wielded the heaviest weapons with ease, lay motionless at his sides, like dead weight. Most disturbing of all, his breathing had become a labored wheeze that suggested his lungs were filling with fluid. The psychological torment accompanying his physical deterioration proved equally devastating. Alexander began experiencing hallucinations that transported him back to the darkest moments of his campaigns. He would suddenly sit upright, eyes wide with terror, and scream warnings about Persian cavalry advancing through his bedroom. He spoke to his dead father Philip, begging forgiveness for crimes only he understood. Most heartbreaking of all, he would reach out desperately for Hephaestion, calling his beloved companion's name over and over until exhaustion claimed him. These episodes revealed a mind unraveling under the weight of 13 years' worth of accumulated trauma. The young prince who had dreamed of emulating Achilles had become something far more complex and damaged. Every city he had burned, every friend he had killed in paranoid rage, every act of brutality committed in the name of glory now returned to haunt his fevered consciousness. The court officials who witnessed these breakdowns found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths about the man they had worshipped as a living god. The composed, brilliant strategist who had conquered half the world was revealed to be profoundly human in his suffering, vulnerable to the same psychological wounds that would destroy any mortal subjected to such experiences. Meanwhile, the physical symptoms continued their relentless progression. Alexander's extremities began showing signs of poor circulation, his fingers and toes turning a disturbing shade of blue-black that suggested tissue death. His urine, when he could produce any, had become completely dark, almost black, indicating that his kidneys were shutting down. Most ominously, his breathing had developed a distinctive sweet smell that ancient physicians recognized as a harbinger of imminent death. The king's appearance had become so altered that many of his own soldiers failed to recognize him when they were finally permitted to file past his bedside. The golden-haired youth, whose beauty had once been compared to Apollo, had become something from a nightmare. His face had sunken inward, the flesh seeming to melt away from his bones. His eyes, once bright with intelligence and ambition, had become dull and unfocused, staring at visions only he could see. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Alexander's condition was his intermittent lucidity. Between episodes of delirium and pain, he would suddenly become completely aware of his situation, understanding with crystalline clarity that he was dying. During these moments, the full horror of his position would crash down upon him. He could feel his body systematically failing, could sense his legendary strength ebbing away drop by drop, yet remained powerless to stop the process. These periods of awareness became torture sessions unto themselves. Alexander would weep silently, not from physical pain, but from the psychological agony of recognizing that all his conquests, all his achievements, all the blood spilled in his name would mean nothing once death claimed him. The empire he had sacrificed everything to build would fragment the moment he drew his final breath, torn apart by the very generals who now stood vigil beside his bed. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had spent his adult life defying the natural order, who had demanded worship as a divine being, found himself completely subject to the most mundane of human experiences. Death, the great equalizer, recognized neither his royal bloodline nor his godlike pretensions. In those lucid moments, Alexander understood that he would die exactly as any common soldier, alone and afraid, despite being surrounded by thousands of followers. As his condition entered its final phase, Alexander's body began exhibiting symptoms that thoroughly mystified his attendants. His skin developed strange discolorations that appeared and disappeared without pattern. Witnesses reported seeing what looked like writing or symbols forming temporarily across his flesh before fading away. Though this may have been hallucinations brought on by the stress of watching their king die. More disturbing were the sounds emanating from Alexander's body during his final days. Physicians noted unusual gurgling noises from his abdomen that seemed to have their own rhythm, independent of his breathing or heartbeat. Some described hearing what sounded like whispered conversations coming from within his chest cavity, though no rational explanation existed for such phenomena. The smell surrounding Alexander's sickbed became so overwhelming that servants had to burn massive quantities of incense and aromatic woods just to make the royal chamber bearable. This wasn't simply the odor of sickness, but something far more complex and disturbing. Veterans who had witnessed countless battlefield deaths claimed they had never encountered anything like the stench that emanated from their dying king. Perhaps most unnaturing of all was Alexander's progressive loss of basic human functions. By the 10th day, he had lost complete control over his bodily processes, requiring constant care from servants who had to steel themselves against revulsion to perform their duties. The proud warrior, who had once stood before cheering armies in gleaming armor, now lay helpless in his own filth, unable to perform even the most basic acts of self-care. His speech, when it came at all, had deteriorated into incomprehensible mumbling, punctuated by sudden screams of agony. The voice that had once commanded armies across 3 continents could no longer form coherent words. When he tried to communicate, only guttural sounds emerged, more animal than human in their desperation. The transformation was so complete that many of his oldest companions privately wondered whether their Alexander had already died days earlier, leaving behind only a suffering shell, animated by some malevolent force. The man they had followed across the known world seemed to have vanished, replaced by something that challenged their understanding of life and death itself. As news of the king's deteriorating conditions spread beyond the palace walls, the massive military encampment surrounding Babylon began showing signs of panic. Soldiers who had conquered empires found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't fight, couldn't negotiate with, and couldn't understand. Their invincible leader was being destroyed by something invisible, something that rendered all their weapons and tactics completely useless. The psychological impact on Alexander's army cannot be overstated. These were men who had followed him through the Hindu Kush, across the burning deserts of Gedrosia, into battles where victory seemed impossible. They had witnessed his courage in situations that would have broken ordinary mortals, had seen him share their hardships and dangers without complaint. Now they watched helplessly as something systematically dismantled everything that had made him legendary. The military camp that had once buzzed with confident discussions of future conquests fell into an eerie silence, broken only by whispered prayers and desperate speculation. Veteran soldiers who had faced down charging elephants and Persian scythed chariots found themselves paralyzed by something they couldn't comprehend. Their god-king, the man who had made them masters of the world, was being consumed by an enemy that laughed at swords and spears. Word began filtering through the ranks that Alexander could no longer recognize even his closest companions. Men who had shared his tent for over a decade approached his bedside only to be met with vacant stares, or, worse, expressions of terror as if he saw demons where familiar faces should be. The psychological bond that had held his diverse army together, forged through shared victories and unshakable faith in their leader's invincibility, began fracturing as reality set in. Inside the royal chamber, the scene had become something from humanity's darkest nightmares. Alexander's body had begun producing sounds that defied natural explanation. Physicians reported hearing what seemed like conversations between multiple voices emanating from his chest, though his lips barely moved. The rhythmic gurgling from his abdomen had developed into something resembling music, if music could be composed of agony and despair. His physical form continued its grotesque transformation. The skin that had once gleamed like polished bronze now appeared almost transparent, revealing the dark network of failing organs beneath. Strange patterns would appear across his flesh, geometric designs that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. Some witnesses claimed these markings resembled ancient cuneiform script, as if his body had become a tablet upon which invisible hands were writing messages in a language older than civilization. The odor surrounding Alexander's deathbed had evolved beyond mere putrescence into something that seemed to assault not just the nostrils, but the very soul. Servants who entered the chamber would emerge pale and shaking, claiming the smell carried whispers that tried to lodge themselves in their minds. Even the hardiest veterans found themselves retching uncontrollably after brief exposure, their bodies rejecting whatever emanated from their dying king. Most disturbing was how Alexander's remaining consciousness seemed to fracture into multiple personalities during his final days. He would speak in voices that belonged to men he had killed years earlier, carrying on conversations with Persian nobles who had died at the Battle of Gaugamela, or Indian princes who had fallen defending their cities. These weren't mere hallucinations, but detailed interactions where Alexander seemed to inhabit the memories and perspectives of his victims. During one particularly harrowing episode, witnesses reported that Alexander spent an entire night speaking in perfect Persian, conducting what appeared to be a trial where he served simultaneously as judge, prosecutor, and defendant. He would shift between voices, arguing cases for and against his own actions, detailing atrocities that hadn't been recorded in any official histories. The specificity of these accounts suggested he was accessing memories that shouldn't have been his own. The royal physicians, driven to desperation by their complete inability to help their patient, began consulting oracles and mystics from across the empire. Babylonian priests examined Alexander's symptoms and declared them consistent with divine punishment for hubris. Egyptian embalmers, summoned despite their specialty being the already dead, took one look at the king's condition and fled the palace in terror, claiming they had never seen corruption advance so rapidly in living flesh. By the 11th day, Alexander's body had begun exhibiting properties that challenged basic understanding of human anatomy. His pulse, when it could be detected at all, seemed to originate from multiple points throughout his torso rather than his heart. His breathing had become completely irregular, sometimes stopping for minutes at a time, before resuming with explosive gasps that sprayed blood across his bed sheets. The transformation of his extremities had accelerated into something that resembled mummification occurring in reverse. His fingers and toes had turned completely black, yet instead of becoming brittle and dry, they had taken on a waxy consistency that left dark stains on everything they touched. The flesh seemed to be liquefying from the inside out while maintaining its external shape, creating a grotesque parody of the hands that had once wielded weapons with a legendary skill. Alexander's eyes, once described as having the intensity of lightning, had become windows into something far more disturbing than mere death. They had taken on an oily quality that reflected light in unnatural ways, sometimes appearing to show scenes from distant battlefields or glimpses of places that existed only in nightmares. Attendants reported seeing their own worst fears reflected in those dying orbs, as if Alexander's gaze had become a conduit for humanity's collective darkness. The sounds emerging from his throat had evolved beyond human vocalization into something that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate within the bones of those present. These weren't screams in any conventional sense, but rather vibrations that carried the weight of accumulated suffering from 13 years of conquest. Everyone who heard them would later report experiencing vivid dreams of burning cities and crying children for months afterward. Perhaps most heartbreaking was how Alexander's legendary intelligence, the brilliant strategic mind that had revolutionized warfare, flickered in and out of awareness like a dying flame. During brief moments of clarity, he would recognize the horror of his situation with devastating precision. He understood that his body had become something monstrous, that his death would be remembered not as a hero's end, but as a cautionary tale about the price of unchecked ambition. In these lucid intervals, Alexander would attempt to give final orders or impart wisdom to his generals, but the words that emerged bore no resemblance to his intentions. Instead of strategic insights or political instructions, he would speak in riddles that seemed to predict future disasters or describe events that had occurred in places he had never visited. His attendants carefully recorded these utterances, hoping they contained some hidden meaning, but the fragments painted only pictures of endless warfare and civilizations crumbling into dust. The palace staff had begun showing signs of psychological breakdown from prolonged exposure to their king's condition. Servants who had proudly served in the royal household for decades requested transfers to distant provinces, rather than continue witnessing Alexander's deterioration. Those who remained often required sedation with wine and opiates, just to perform their basic duties. The corruption spreading through Alexander's body had begun affecting the very air around him. The atmosphere in his chamber took on a weight that made breathing difficult, as if the space itself had become contaminated by his suffering. Visitors would find themselves gasping for air after only minutes in his presence, their lungs struggling to process whatever invisible poison surrounded the dying conqueror. Even more disturbing was how Alexander's condition seemed to be spreading beyond his physical form. Servants reported that objects he had touched would retain an unnatural coldness for days afterward. His bed sheets, when removed for cleaning, would crumble at the touch despite being made from the finest silk. The very stones of his chamber floor had begun developing hairline cracks that spread outward from his bed like a spider's web of decay. The psychological impact on his inner circle had become catastrophic. Generals who had stood unflinching in the face of overwhelming enemy forces found themselves unable to remain in Alexander's presence for more than a few minutes without breaking down completely. These were men who had witnessed the aftermath of siege warfare, who had ordered the execution of thousands, yet they fled from their dying king, like children running from monsters in the dark. The transformation of Alexander's voice had entered its final phase. What had once been capable of inspiring armies to attempt the impossible had become something that seemed to speak directly to the primal fears buried deep within human consciousness. Even when his words were incomprehensible, the tone carried implications of cosmic horror that left listeners questioning the fundamental nature of reality itself. As the 12th day dawned over ancient Babylon, it became clear that whatever was happening to Alexander the Great transcended ordinary death. His body had become a battlefield where human mortality wrestled with forces that belonged to nightmares rather than natural processes. The greatest conqueror in history was being conquered in return, not by any earthly enemy, but by something that seemed to embody the accumulated suffering of everyone who had fallen before his ambition. The end, when it finally came, would prove even more horrifying than the prolonged agony that preceded it. But even in his final moments, Alexander's ordeal would reveal truths about power, mortality, and the price of godlike ambition that would haunt the ancient world long after his corpse had been sealed away in its golden tomb. The final hours brought revelations that would have broken the minds of lesser men. As Alexander's body entered its death throes, the very fabric of reality around him seemed to warp and twist in ways that defied comprehension. The chamber that had once housed the most powerful ruler on Earth became a nexus of supernatural horror that challenged everything his attendants thought they understood about life and death. On that 13th morning, Alexander's breathing had developed a rhythm that bore no resemblance to natural respiration. Each inhalation seemed to draw something dark and viscous into his lungs, while every exhalation released vapors that made the air shimmer like heat rising from sun-baked stones. The physicians who dared approach close enough to examine him reported that these vapors carried the scent of burning cities and the metallic tang of spilled blood from 1,000 battlefields. His skin had begun displaying phenomena that transcended medical understanding. Patterns would emerge across his flesh, not bruises or lesions, but designs that seemed to tell stories of conquest and carnage. Observers swore they could see entire battles playing out across his torso, miniature armies clashing in formations that mirrored the great victories of his campaigns. These visions weren't static images, but moving tableaux that shifted and changed with each labored heartbeat. The sounds emanating from Alexander's body had evolved into something that seemed to bypass human hearing entirely. Veterans who had stood firm against the war cries of charging elephants found themselves driven to their knees by noises that resonated in their bones and made their teeth ache. These weren't screams of pain, but something far more primordial, as if the accumulated anguish of every soul his armies had sent to early graves was finding voice through his failing form. Most disturbing was how Alexander's consciousness had begun fragmenting into multiple awareness streams. He would speak simultaneously in different voices, conducting conversations between aspects of himself that seemed to represent every life he had taken, every city he had burned, every dream he had crushed beneath his ambition. These weren't hallucinations, but coherent discussions where each voice possessed distinct memories and perspectives that Alexander shouldn't have been able to access. During one particularly horrifying episode, witnesses reported that Alexander spent hours reliving the siege of Tyre from the perspective of every defender who had died on the walls. He described in vivid detail the terror of mothers clutching their children as Macedonian soldiers broke through their defenses, the agony of warriors who fought to the last breath knowing their cause was hopeless. His voice would shift between that of a crying infant, a desperate father, an elderly priest praying to gods who would not answer, The transformation of his physical form had accelerated beyond anything natural. His extremities had begun to literally dissolve, not through decay, but through some process that seemed to convert solid flesh into liquid shadow. The fingers that had once gripped sword hilts with deadly precision now leaked a substance that wasn't quite blood, wasn't quite oil, but something that stained everything it touched with permanent darkness. His face, once considered handsome enough to rival the gods themselves, had become a canvas for horrors that existed beyond mortal comprehension. The features would shift and flow like melted wax, sometimes showing glimpses of the young prince who had dreamed of glory, sometimes revealing the faces of his victims superimposed over his own. Servants who looked directly at him would later swear they had seen their own deaths reflected in his eyes, visions of how they would die that would prove unnervingly accurate in years to come. The royal physicians had long since abandoned any pretense of treatment. They huddled in corners of the chamber, clutching religious amulets and whispering prayers to gods they hoped might protect them from whatever force was consuming their king. The greatest medical minds of the ancient world had been reduced to terrified spectators at an exhibition of supernatural malevolence that mocked their understanding of life and death. Alexander's body had begun producing substances that violated natural law. His sweat had taken on properties that made metal corrode on contact and caused plant life to wither instantly. The sheets beneath him would crumble into dust within hours of touching his skin, despite being woven from the finest materials available in the empire. Even the stones of the floor beneath his bed had begun developing cracks that spread in patterns resembling the territorial boundaries of his conquests. The psychological impact on his inner circle had moved beyond mere horror into realms of existential terror. Men who had shared his tent through years of campaigning now questioned whether they had ever truly known him at all. The Alexander who had inspired such devotion seemed to have been merely a mask worn by something far older and more terrible, something that had used human ambition as a vehicle for purposes that mortal minds couldn't grasp. As his condition entered its final phase, Alexander's voice began speaking in languages that predated recorded history. Ancient Babylonian priests, summoned in desperation, recognized fragments of dialects that had been dead for millennia. He would recite what sounded like incantations or prophecies, his words carrying implications that made seasoned soldiers weep without understanding why. The air around his deathbed had become thick with presences that couldn't be seen, but could definitely be felt. Attendants reported sensing invisible crowds gathered around the dying king, as if every soul his conquests had displaced was present to witness his final moments. The temperature in the chamber would fluctuate wildly, sometimes becoming so cold that breath misted in the air, other times growing so hot that metal buckles became painful to touch. Alexander's eyes, in his final conscious moments, had become windows into vistas of unimaginable suffering. Those brave enough to meet his gaze reported seeing landscapes of ash and bone stretching to distant horizons, cities burning under alien stars, armies of the dead marching in formations that defied geometry. These visions weren't metaphorical, but seemed to show actual places where the consequences of unlimited ambition had played out across cosmic scales. The transformation of his blood had reached its culmination. When physicians attempted to bleed him in a final desperate treatment, what emerged wasn't the crimson fluid of life, but something black and viscous that moved with its own purpose. This substance would pool and form shapes that resembled maps of territories yet to be conquered, battle formations that wouldn't be devised for centuries, or simply abstract patterns that hurt to look at directly. The silence that followed Alexander's final breath was more terrifying than any sound his dying body had produced. As the last traces of whatever had consumed him faded from the chamber, those who witnessed his end understood they had seen something that would reshape their understanding of power, mortality, and the price of godlike ambition. The sanitized histories would never record these horrors, but the truth remains buried in the sealed tomb that no authority dares open. Alexander the Great didn't simply die. he was systematically destroyed by forces that recognize no earthly authority, leaving behind only the haunting reminder that some victories come at costs too terrible to comprehend.